Welcome to the Superstar Communicator podcast. My name is Susan Heaton-Wright, a leading impact, speaking and communications expert. My aim is to show you how to make an impact so you will be heard, listened to and respected for career success. Listen weekly to the podcast and go to our website, superstarcommunicator.com. Hello everybody, this is Susan Heaton-Wright from the Superstar Communicator podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in today. I've got a really good guest that I know is going to give you a lot of value. This is regarding podcasting. Now, in the last year, there have been many people who have launched their podcasts. Hurrah! I'm absolutely delighted that there are more people on the block who are producing fabulous content. But do you know what? It is hard work. And for many businesses who are generating business and revenue from other streams, to spend a lot of time and energy or to outsource it to a third party, which obviously costs money, can be a huge investment time-wise and also financially. Yes, this is a really good way of raising your profile and showing your credibility, but for most people, being able to generate much income from a podcast is unlikely. I don't want to be nasty about that, but I do know that there are a lot of people who are selling courses on podcasting. They are promising all of these things, which in reality, unless you put an awful lot of time and money into it, you are not going to receive the financial rewards that possibly you have been promised. However, I know that from being a podcaster, it is great for other ways because I'm reaching out to my community, I'm sharing fabulous content, I'm connecting with other people, I'm able to show what I know about speaking and also podcasting. But I want to tip this on its head because as well as podcasting, for a podcaster being a fantastic way to show your credibility in a particular topic or an area of expertise, you can also do that as a podcast guest. Now, that is a way of speaking. It's a really good way to reach to a new audience, to show your credibility, your expertise, and I have got the perfect guest for this. He is called James Mulvany, he is the CEO of Matchmaker.fm. Now, this isn't a naughty site. This is a site for podcasters and podcast guests. So as a podcaster, I engage with other podcasters. We have ideas, we share expertise and tips and all of those sorts of things. But there is also a huge list of people who are wanting to be guests, who have something to say that could add real value to your podcast. So I'm thinking, as you're thinking now, that you could be a podcast guest. And James has got some really good tips for this. He is a multiple entrepreneur. He has owned loads of businesses and sold them. He's an angel investor. He says that he has never worked in his life, but of course he has, because he's been building up with these businesses. He also has a fantastic YouTube site which has got lots of tips, both for podcast guests as well as podcasters. So welcome, James. Welcome.
Thanks, Susan. Pleasure to be here. And it absolutely. Matchmaker sounds like a dating website, doesn't it? But it's got nothing to do with that at all. It's a place for professionals, I guess, to network and meet each other. And with a specific focus on podcasting.
And I found it really useful. I've had some fantastic podcast opportunities. I have to say I've been so busy with other things, but I've used it. It is very user-friendly. So congratulations on that.
Thanks. Yeah, the idea was we wanted to make it sort of as simple as possible and ultimately create like a high value community, you know, with people who are kind of actively engaged with the platform.
And because this discussion is about being a great guest, tell me about some of the times that you've been a guest on podcasts.
Absolutely. So I think I started my journey into podcasting probably about 10 years ago. So initially I had a sort of small office. I'd kind of just started my business, and I had a friend called Steve who had another company. We used to share an office. So one day we decided it'd be fun to sort of sit down and start recording podcast episodes. At the time I was based in Huddersfield, which is where I went to university, and Steve had just recently moved back to Leeds. So sort of as a kind of way to kind of keep chatting and keep in touch. Every couple of weeks he'd come across to Huddersfield, we'd sit down, we'd record a podcast episode, and really we just talked about what we were doing in our businesses, different marketing techniques that we'd been learning. And it was a really good way of kind of just digesting what we'd learned and sort of putting it into an audio form. And this was in like 2008, 2009. And back then, I think podcasts were still really in their infancy.
Yes.
So it wasn't a mainstream medium. There were still a lot of people who weren't really aware of it. And I think it was kind of more a platform or a medium that was reserved for the enthusiasts.
Yes.
So although we had great fun recording it, I don't think it had too many listeners, but it was a really fun experience. And it was just kind of, it opened my eyes to what was possible. I think, fast forward 10 years, sort of to 2018, and that was when things had started to really turn, and podcasting had transformed from this medium that was something that kind of was maybe a little bit nerdy or sort of something for the enthusiasts, to something that's actually now quite mainstream. Pretty much everyone's listening to podcasts. If you go up to someone in the street and say, do you know what a podcast is? I think most people are like to say, yeah, I'm aware of it, or at least most people maybe even have listened to them. So as a result, nowadays, I think it's a useful platform for any kind of business person or marketer or public speaker to help grow their personal brand, to meet interesting people and build useful, valuable connections. And finally, just to kind of, impart knowledge on people and share your wisdom, your learnings with an audience.
That's, really, really interesting to hear. I've been podcasting for 6.5 years. And prior to that, do you remember Audio FM?
Yeah, vaguely.
Which was almost like a sort of pre-podcast. I used to do that to share content.
Yeah.
But I think it is really interesting because we want to be able to share our knowledge and expertise. But how can you get the balance between you almost doing a hard sell on a podcast and actually it being interesting for the podcast host?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is, don't go in all guns blazing. I've certainly had people on my show before where it's just really felt like from the get-go that they're just there to sell a product or sell their services or really just kind of promote themselves. I think if you're going in as a guest, it's important to let the host lead and answer their questions, really. And likewise, if you're sat on the other side of the fence and you're doing the interview, make sure you've got some good questions for that guest, because ultimately, it's your responsibility to try and get as much value and as much information out of them for your audience as you can. So, it's really just about respecting the kind of the host and guest relationship, from both perspectives. Obviously, when you get a guest on your podcast, there's always going to be that sense that they want to promote their product or service. I think most people are quite happy to say, provide value up front, discuss what they're there to talk about, and then sort of, name drop their website or whatever at the end. And I think that's probably the right way of doing it, really, because ultimately the conversation needs to be interesting for the audience. And, again, when we speak to people who are starting new podcasts, especially for their businesses, one of the things that we always say is, start with your audience. Who is going to be listening to this? What is the point of you doing this? It's not just say a case of, well, let's create a podcast because it seems like a good idea. There's got to be a reason behind it. And I think once you can kind of define that reason and define who your audience is going to be, you can then use that to form a really solid strategy and foundation for the concept or the content which is contained within the podcast.
And how do people like you, me, because we're both podcast guests as well as podcasters, how do we approach podcasters? What have you found very, very useful, that things that have worked that we can share with the audience?
Absolutely. I think the first thing to remember is be authentic and make sure that, you know, you're just representing you. You're not sort of claiming some outlandish things that you've, the stuff that's not true. So be authentic. I think try and build a pitch around actually genuinely what you can deliver to that person's podcast. Like if you've got a good idea of what the podcast contains, and perhaps they've not talked about a specific topic, maybe you're an expert, say in email marketing, and you want to approach podcasts that are about marketing specifically to talk about email, we'll make that really clear. You know, talk about your value proposition, what you can offer as an individual, and just kind of keep it short and sweet. You know, when you approach someone, generally they're happy to, you know, be open to suggestions. So I think if you can kind of give them an idea of what that show could contain, you know, they're more likely to turn around and say yes, rather than just saying, oh, I just want to be on your podcast for the sake of it.
Yes. We were speaking just before we started about, I'm increasingly getting PR companies contact me. Their clients have just released books, and it's quite obvious that it's a cut and paste job. They've not listened to the podcast. They don't really know how their representative will fit in with the podcast. What would you say to those people?
Well, I think, you know, it's a case of, I guess some people just send so many messages, or eventually someone will turn around and say yes. But I agree. I think tailoring your pitch to that podcast is certainly the best way forward. If you can't tailor it specifically to each podcast you're contacting, at least try and create a few different variations of a pitch. So, for example, when I did my 30 podcasts in 30 days challenge, I sat down, I thought, okay, what sort of podcast would I like to be on? And I kind of categorized into three lots, if you like. So firstly, it was kind of podcasts relating to growing businesses, startups, entrepreneurship, that type of thing. The second category was more marketing and sales focused podcasts. And thirdly was personal development and public speaking and those kind of things. So what I did then is I created, if you like, 3 separate pitches for each of these, talking about my skills or my knowledge, or what could be, but basically the application of what I was talking about, how that could be applied to each specific area. So at least then, rather than just being a generic, oh, hello, I'd like to be on your podcast, you know, it's like, hi, I want to be on your podcast about marketing. Here's how I think we could help. So for example, for me, it was talking about, you know, how going on a guest tour can be a really, really great way to promote a new product or a service, especially if you've just launched a new platform or a product. And, you know, how that process can effectively be replicated by others. For the entrepreneurship side of things, it was quite often, you know, talking about my experience in business, how I grew companies, also the concept of how we launched Matchmaker, which is the platform you mentioned before, how we kind of launched it really as an MVP to begin with, to kind of test an idea and then took it to market. So really, although, you know, we contacted lots of podcasts to try and, you know, hit this target, we were tailoring that message dependent on the category of the podcast.
So interesting. I mean, you've got a video of this, haven't you, where you explained all of that. And I loved watching the video. I think I fed that back to you. But you mentioned that you actually videoed yourself talking about those 3 different topics.
Yes.
I thought that was a brilliant idea.
Yeah. I mean, again, it just makes it shows that you're authentic, like I said before. And, you know, also you get a better, if you can send the podcast that you're pitching a little video clip. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. Just talk to your webcam, you know, for a couple of minutes. It just kind of gives them an idea of your personality, an idea of how you talk, idea of your energy, which I think is quite important, because, you know, there's different guests and different hosts will resonate well in different ways. You know, not every guest is going to be right for every single podcast, and vice versa. So I think having that communication before, you know, before you actually get in touch, or before you actually have a conversation with them, it kind of gives them that idea. And also it's a way to stand out, because everyone, like you say, is just sending these copy and paste messages. So if you can back it up by a short video clip, it's going to make you stand out from the crowd.
And I mean, I think that it was genius what you did with
Mm.
that. Now, last week I interviewed a lovely lady called Sarah
Mhm.
Ali Chowdhury, and she talks about raising your visibility. And she said something that I felt was interesting, and I'm sure you'll comment on this, that
Yep.
if you are a guest, it is it's your job as well to promote the podcast.
Oh, completely. Yeah, it should be a reciprocal thing. I think, whenever you hear that an episode's going live, make sure that you have that leave that line of communication open so the host can get in touch with you when the episode's ready to go live. Ask them if they can send across some assets, and if you're a podcast host, it really helps if you can send across some ways of promoting it, so like a little image that they can post onto
Yes.
LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever platform they might be on, and also link back to your website. And again, that's part of the value of podcasting, I think, both from both perspectives, is you're getting more exposure to different audiences that you wouldn't otherwise have necessarily been exposed to. That works because obviously the guest is sharing your podcast with them, but also then the guest is getting access to your audience too. So it works both ways, and I think that's the kind of the magic of it, really.
One thing that really hit me was that I contacted you. I thought you'd be a brilliant guest. And very, very quickly you responded, which was so good. Um, have you had situations where you've invited people to come on and there's silence?
Yeah.
Or, yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
it's
sometimes
weird.
people are busy. They miss messages. I think sometimes being persistent is key. If someone doesn't respond first time around, don't let that put you off. Just try and follow up. Don't follow up to the point where you're becoming annoying. I think, but there's no harm in giving people a nudge every now and again. And then, but ultimately, sometimes people just stop responding or they're not interested. So you have to just move on. But there's so many people out there now, and there's so many different ways that you can get in touch with guests. That you've just got to make sure that you're proactive, I think, and also try and think outside the box. Like look at, for example, Amazon have got a website. You can see all of the book launches that are coming up over the next couple of months. So find authors that sound interesting on that list and reach out to them, say, would you be interested in coming? Because obviously authors generally have got a great deal of expertise in a certain area, so that's a good way of finding people as well.
That's a really, really good idea.
Mm.
But tell us a little bit more about your 30 podcast challenge.
Yeah,
That sounds incredible.
it was fun, but it was very hard work. So the idea was, I've appeared on quite a few podcasts in the past, not loads, but obviously after we launched Matchmaker, I thought, well, the proof is in the pudding. So I wanted to kind of really demonstrate the power of what we'd created.
Yes.
And also it was great. It was great to just meet so many people. So the idea was 30 podcasts within 30 days. I ended up doing closer to 40 actually within 30 days. We excluded the weekend, so I had a little bit of a break. So it worked out to be, I think, closer to sort of 45 days or something, basically just looked at the working weeks, a 6-week period, I think. But yeah, it was just a case of getting stuck in, reaching out to podcasts that we thought would be, interested in the story, and just having conversations just like this one, really. And again, I think it's certainly, if you think about it, part of what gave me the opportunity to do it was being in lockdown. I don't think if we were in the office, we're normally office based, quite a busy environment, lots of distractions, lots of meetings. And actually to be able to commit to doing that whilst I was in the office would probably not have worked as well. But because I was at home and I had that space around me and I had that time, I thought, right, perfect time to do it. Let's just get stuck in. But if you look at the actual time, obviously each recording I did was probably between, on average, 30 minutes and an hour long. For that amount of commitment for each interview, you then get exposure to someone else's audience who are then potentially interested in your product or your services. You get to meet someone who's incredible and generally has an interesting story themselves. And, likewise, I've a few of the guests, a few of the hosts that I was on their podcast, we've then gone and recorded other things together. So it's just a really good way of growing your network as well.
Oh, what a fantastic idea. Listeners, this might be the way forward.
Yes.
Having your own 30-day challenge of podcasts, brilliant idea. I'm going to segue. I'm going to be slightly cheeky here because you've obviously pitched for investments.
Yes.
And I know that this is about speaking and communication. Can you give three? I'm putting you on the spot here. Sorry.
Yeah.
But is there any way that you could give 3 top tips? Because I know there are a few people that are listening that are pitching for business at the moment, for investment, sorry.
For investment, okay. I think first of all, you need to be. It's interesting because I haven't done any angel investing for a couple of years. I went through a period of about 2 years where I made a handful, and I was also involved in an accelerator program. So I
Yeah.
invested in, I think, 6 different businesses as part of that, and I think 3 or 4 others as well. But I did sit through a lot of pitching sessions where I'd go in, I'd watch businesses of all kinds, of all walks of life, not just necessarily tech businesses, but sort of brick and mortar businesses as well. And it was the ones that stand out are the ones that I think have a really, to begin with, just a clear demonstration, or sort of cheesy as it sounds, like an elevator pitch, which just really sums up exactly what they do or what they provide in a short space of time. Because once you understand that, and you get that within a space of a minute or two, you've got they've got your attention. I think secondly, you need to then back it up with good claims. Your presentation, your pitch needs to be solid in terms of, like, you need to understand your numbers. I think you need to present it well and not make it confusing, just keep it simple. And also then be prepared for questions and be prepared to answer those questions. And I think if you can kind of get those 3 things right, you've got a good chance of getting investment. But ultimately as well, I think certainly at the moment, I imagine it might be quite difficult, just given the circumstances. I don't know how many of these pitch events are going on. I think probably a lot of them have been moved online. Again, investors are holding on to their money, etc. So it's not always an easy, straightforward process. But and again, some businesses just aren't right for investment. There was one business that we were really, it was me and a few other investors, and we'd sort of formed almost like a syndicate, and we were really keen on the product and we could see a real value there. We really wanted to invest in it. But for some reason, the guy just didn't want to. We kind of went to the stage where we were almost doing due diligence, and he wasn't keen to take the leap. And in the end, we pulled out. And I don't, to my knowledge, he's never managed to secure investment since. So I think you have to be open to compromise and a bit of negotiation there too.
Very, very interesting. And do you find that it's actually the questions at the end that challenge you to review your vision?
Yeah, I think so. I think when you see, it's interesting because I learned a lot during this process of doing angel investments from other investors. They ask questions that you wouldn't have necessarily thought of, and then you ask questions that they might not necessarily have thought of. So I think that's really interesting as well from sitting on that side of the fence. But I think, ultimately, if you're a business pitching for that investment, you've got to just try and make sure that you're controlling the whole process from end to end, and really managing everyone's expectations.
And that gets us back to podcast guests in a way, doesn't it? Managing expectations. Mm-hmm. You have mentioned about the matchmaker.fm.
Yeah.
And this is clearly the way forward for listeners who are wanting to be on more podcasts. Can you tell us a little bit about how it works?
Absolutely. So Matchmaker is really straightforward. It's similar to a dating service. We actually build it as the Tinder for podcasters when we launched. And effectively, you sign up, you create a profile, and you can actually record a little video profile now as well as a guest, and explain to potential podcasts, what value you can offer. So generally speaking, you might want to include some examples of podcasts you've appeared on before, tell them about your business achievements. If you've got specific areas of expertise, perhaps you're a scientist or whatever it might be, make sure that you're completely clear on your profile about what value you can bring to the table. And the idea is then podcasts can get in touch with you and sort of invite you to be on their show. And likewise, if you're proactive, you can look through the list of podcasts, you can refine them based on category, reach out to them and say, look, I think I'd be interested in appearing on your show. And the idea of the platform really is that people sat on both sides of the fence, whether or not you're a podcaster or a guest, and actually most people tend to have both profiles as well. They're actively looking for engaging with guests. So it's not like reaching out to someone on Twitter or LinkedIn where they might say yes, they might say no. The idea is we're trying to cultivate an atmosphere where everyone's really keen.
Interestingly, one of your colleagues contacted me before you launched
Yeah.
to be on the guest list, so to speak. So I was very flattered to have been on the Tinder podcast side.
Yeah. Well, that's good.
Yeah, and although certainly from my point of view, I've been really busy with other things in the last few months. I got some great opportunities through the site, so I will be doing a little bit more now things have quietened down.
Yeah. I mean, I think, this is, again, you can set your profile to away if you're not actively looking to get booked on podcasts, or if you're a podcast and you've got your diary full, so you can toggle your profile away or available.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's one of these things, you kind of get in what you get out what you put in.
Yes.
The more, if you're proactive, we have some people who sign up and they say, it's brilliant, I've been booked on 5 podcasts within a 24-hour period of signing up, and you're like, fantastic. It's really good to hear when people get results like that. But then also, likewise, we have people who say, oh, I signed up and I've never heard anything. And I think a lot of the time it's because they've not necessarily been proactive. They just kind of, if you sit there and hope for the best, you might not necessarily get someone contact you. You might do, you never know. Or if you just fill your profile out with a couple of lines and that's it, there's not everyone's going to jump on board because they don't really know much about you. So it's just about, making sure that you're writing a compelling pitch, and that you're being proactive in contacting people. And like you said, don't just copy and paste the same message again and again. At least try and tailor it somewhat to the kinds of podcasts that you're approaching.
So how can people register for the site if they want to be either a podcast guest or a podcaster?
Absolutely. So it's the same sign-up process for both. If you just head to matchmaker.fm and you can connect using Google, LinkedIn or Facebook. We're going to add an email sign up to it soon as well. So sign up process, really straightforward. Just fill out your profile. As I say, you upload a picture, or if you're a guest, you can now record a little video as well of yourself, like a 1-minute teaser. And yeah, it's free to sign up. So get on board. And I think, again, if you're thinking about launching your own podcast, sometimes appearing as a guest on other people's podcasts is a good way of kind of getting some experience and dipping your feet in the water a bit,
Brilliant. So listeners, I think that we've heard some amazing tips from James. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think that's good. I mean, if you want to get in touch with me, if you head to jamesm.com/connect, all of my links to my social profiles are on there. And like Susan mentioned, I'm always pushing out videos and trying to be as helpful as I can, little hints and tips of, growing podcasts, growing your audience, and being a good guest as well.
Absolutely brilliant stuff. Listeners, I highly recommend you watch some of these videos because they're full of value.
Thanks very much, Susan.
And I'll make sure that I put the links to your different sites on the information about this particular podcast. Thank you so much for coming on, James.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Wow, I hope you enjoyed that interview with James. What a fantastic interview with so many top tips. And this is someone who really knows about being a podcast guest and from a podcast host perspective as well, which is really important. So don't forget to watch his videos, contact him if necessary. And I should say that I also have my ebook called Superstar Communicator Podcast Guest Tips. And if you would like a copy, all you need to do is to go to superstarcommunicator.com/podcast guest tips, and you will get an ebook with that. I will put that in the notes, but until next time, I hope you've been inspired. Keep well, keep safe. Bye-bye. You have been listening to the Superstar Communicator podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and review the podcast on iTunes and on apps. Please contact us if you want to discuss any topic, could suggest a topic for us to include, or a guest who could come onto the podcast. Go to superstarcommunicator.com.